Welcome to Old Path and our study through the Old Testament. We make it to the book of Nehemiah, and actually we're in week 2 of this. We've studied chapter 1. We'll get to chapter 2 today. And when you look at this particular book and considering the era of time, I'm sure if you're going to undertake the study of the book of Nehemiah, you kind of already know a bit of the history of it, but it's worth repeating that the stages of the return of the people to Jerusalem and to Israel in the places that they ended up settling. This is all after the Babylonian captivity. This was after the destruction of Jerusalem, and they were carried away to Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, and then under Cyrus, the Persian king. That history records that the Medo-Persians were inferior in size and number and really even military ability, but they were pretty cunning, and they were able to conquer Babylon for the most part without a battle. And so you can read the history on that. They made their way into the city without having to besiege it from the outside. It's a pretty amazing thing. But all that history is just kind of incidental to what we're studying here, because the 70 years of captivity that was prophesied through Jeremiah, God told them it was coming. It had come to a completion. God began to bring them back under Cyrus, that king who was the first of the kings to be in power after the fall of Babylon and the Babylonians. And so back they come with Zerubbabel, and we studied that. That's the first 6 chapters is in Ezra is dedicated to that. Chapters 7 through 10 is Ezra in that second big wave, but it's decades later. And about 13 years later, what we looked at last week, is when Nehemiah comes in after that era of time from chapters 7 through 10 of the book of Ezra. Nehemiah picks up 13 years later. So God had said he would bring them back to the land. He is making good on his promise to do so. And as we also had looked at both through the book of Ezra and here in Nehemiah, the rebuilding of everything, I am convinced God wanted it to be done quite a bit earlier than that, quite a bit faster. We'll get a little bit of a hint of that, and we got some of that also in Ezra, in that the people, once they got there, had taken on a whole bunch of other priorities. So rather than get back and really throw themselves into the work that they were sent there to do, we will see that Nehemiah takes his charge very, very seriously. But both with Ezra and Nehemiah, they were dismayed at the condition of things once they got there. Nehemiah will be no different, and we get a chance to see him kind of survey his way through Jerusalem in this chapter. That's what's covered in this one. But it begins, and the setting is in Babylon, and so, or what it's called the Citadel at Shushan. There's a question as to where exactly this is, but it would be where the king is. It would be a palatial thing. It's again a citadel. It's a base, if you will, a very important, prominent place where the king would be. So that's the setting. We know that at the end of the last chapter, Nehemiah addresses himself and reveals himself as being the cupbearer to the king. And so tradition would hold that to have that position in the Persian, before a Persian king at that time, would be to put whatever was going to be put before him, in this case wine, but this would be a person who would have to taste it himself, and it would be a way of the king knowing that nobody's trying to poison him, that there would be no harm coming to him. So that's what is for the most part agreed upon, that's what it meant by cupbearer, by not just being some servant who poured whatever the drink was. Again, these guys are all wondering if somebody's trying to knock them off, so it makes sense. And again, history kind of records that is a normal position in the palace people, in the servants of the palace. So with all that being said, we do know that his proximity to the king would be pretty immediate. There are a few things that are in here in this chapter about which people disagree, and I'll point them out as I can. And it also helps to show that there are a few things that are mentioned in here that seem a little outside the norm, and simply meaning it's not necessarily a traditional thing for it to be like this. One of the biggest questions is the scene where the king would be, the queen at his right hand, basically, or right next to him rather, which is certainly not normal if it had a lot of people there. So There are many who just think it's not any kind of a big formal gathering that's there. And again, that's all stuff that's just, it's, I keep using the word, but it's incidental to the actual study that we're doing here. The big picture things remain regardless of what was taking place. And the setting itself, we do know that he went before the king. There's a question as to how long it had taken. It was months later, after the report that was brought to him in chapter 1, before this incident happens with the king. And a lot of people would say, well, if he was the cupbearer, how is it that the king never detected and noticed that there was a problem with him before? And I think there are some very good explanations as to why that is. So I'll give you a couple of the options. I'll let you know the one that I favor. But let's turn to chapter 2, and let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you as we come to your word. We have the privilege that it is to read the things that you have recorded for us, and realizing this is a history that is very much for your people Israel and for the history of your people Israel. And yet there are so many things that we can learn about you through your word and how you interact with your people. And we as the church, we ask, Lord, that you would help us to understand what we can glean from this and how might we apply what we learn of not just the history, but the things that we can learn about you, and how we can have a walk that is exemplary before you, that's acceptable, that is pleasing to you. So we ask, Lord, that you would guide us through this study by your Spirit, and we ask it in Jesus' name. All right, so what we've got here is Nehemiah. He ends chapter 1 by saying there was again this kind of trepidation that he had about what he wanted to do. We know that he's already committed this to a time of fasting and prayer. In fact, let's go ahead and read verse 11. Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to my prayer. And that was covered from verse 5 onward. So he says, be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name, and let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. So he realizes that eventually, as he would see this, there's some speculation as to whether or not this is Nehemiah in picking up the recounting, if you will, historically, that verse 11 is the setup for what happens in chapter 2, and mainly it's because he knows that this is going to be an event eventually. Something's going to happen. But there are some things about it when you read it that I just don't believe that it was some orchestrated thing by him. I don't think that he had, some grand plans, and you'll see that by his reaction. This I do believe. I believe he very much wanted to be there. He realized that his position really would prevent him from just picking up and going. He still is, pretty much a subject of the Persian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, and it's not just that he has privilege to go do whatever he wants to, let alone that he would go and do this because it's considered still a province of Persia. So he doesn't have the freedom to go do the things that he would want to do. He has to get sanction, if you will, to do it, and you'll see that that's here. So, as we read in chapter 2, verse 1, it says, and it came to pass in the month of Nisan, about 4 months later from what we saw in chapter 1, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine, gave it to the king, and now I had never been sad in his presence before. So, he is setting up for us that one particular day when this all kind of came to pass. And there are some people that would say, well, was he not upset before? Clearly he had been given bad information from sad information is probably a better way of putting it, back in chapter 1. And that means that he never had occasion to be before the king before. And some would speculate that the king may very well have been out of the kingdom doing whatever he would be doing somewhere else, and he has just now come back. So he was gone from Kislev to Nisan about 4 months, and now he's back in, and now Nehemiah is going to see him for the first time. I believe also, this is kind of more where I am, because there's nothing that tells us that he was gone. I'm kind of more of the opinion that he did set himself to fasting and prayer, and it doesn't mean that he fasted like for the whole 4 months, but his fasting and his praying I believe, finally came to a place where God had spoken to him about what he is going to do. And so, again, that he's going to have to go back and rebuild, and all of this stuff must come to him, must have him understand. However it may be, we're just not simply told why it was that he had this sadness. It had to have been with him from day one, and yet something is different about this occasion when he is there. Because again, he gives the timetable. It's 4 months down the road. So it says, now, therefore the king said to me, because the king picks up on it, he can see it, why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart, so I became dreadfully afraid. This kind of gives you a bit of an understanding of his relationship to the king. He's not just some guy. The king knows him on a personal level, has to, because he's able to tell him, look at him and say, something's wrong, and I can tell it's not something physical. This is a thing that is of the heart and it's of the mind. But look at his reaction. Dreadfully afraid. It's like, oh no. I mean, was it that obvious kind of a thing? What's he going to do? What's his reaction going to be? He also knows he's going to say what's been going on and what's on his mind. So it all comes down. So again, I don't think for a moment all of this was, today's the day I'm going to do this, and he's got some well laid out plan, and he goes in there and effects the plan. I don't believe that was it at all. It was an occasion where he was going to do what was his role in the kingdom, and there's something that's going on. Wine is before him, and he goes to serve the king, and the king notices it. So it says, and I said to the king, may the king live forever. Again, people disagree on this. It seems more like a kind of a standardized greeting. It's a way of just saying to him, this is my hope, is that you're well and you prosper and that you can live forever. It's just one of those kind of things. And it says, why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste and its gates are burned with fire? Now remember, Artaxerxes would know about these things because Ezra's already been there, and there's already the building that's going on. He's aware of the things that are happening in his provinces. He would, of course, know where Nehemiah is from, but Nehemiah brings up something that's not been brought up before. Everything has been, the focus so far has been populating the area again, letting the people go back from their captivity, and giving them a place of formal worship, so the temple and all the rest. Nehemiah brings up something that hasn't been brought up before, and it is the condition of the gates and of the fortification that there is there around Jerusalem. And so it's not only is it a reminder of their failure and the sacking of it by Nebuchadnezzar, but it's not a safe place. And as we see through Ezra and Nehemiah, there's a lot of opposition, and people just genuinely don't like them, and would do anything that they could to subvert the work that's going on. So after all this time, again, Zerubbabel has been there, or had been there, and that whole thing had been going on for decades. Ezra has been there for over 10 years by the time that this report comes to Nehemiah, and yet still after all that time, nothing has been done to fix the gates, the ways in and out of the city and the fortifications, so people can just kind of come and go as they please. It's wide open for infiltration, and it's wide open if people wanted to come and do something subversive or attack it. There's really no way for them to defend themselves. And again, I said this last week, I have no doubt that God protected them from what may have come otherwise. To some extent anyway. I don't think there would be a full-fledged war there, because they're going to be at war then with Persia. It's one of their provinces. So with all that being said, just again, there's a lot to speculate in this, but we don't want to go beyond the text much more than I probably already have. But it does actually call for some interesting, I think, speculation, some interesting questions that really come up from it. Is why is it like that, and why did that happen? And we can just hypothesize some things. It doesn't change really any of the nuts and bolts of it. So the king then said to me, what do you request? And so I prayed to the God of heaven. So once again, that's one of those, I prayed to the God of heaven. I wasn't expecting, from just the way that this is phrased, it's not like he had this all planned out. This is just happening very much in real time. The king's reply to him gives kind of two impressions. One way that you can view this is, well, what are you asking me for? Like almost, what do you want? Or it could be more is there something that I can do to assist? And again, I tend to believe the latter, mainly because there isn't any kind of an adversarial relationship here, and the king has genuinely asked him, what's wrong? What's the look on your face? If he didn't care about this man to some extent, he's not going to ask that kind of a question. He's not going to follow it up by saying, well, what should be done about it? It doesn't seem to be one of those things of, well, what do you want me to do about it? Rather, is there something that you would have me to do to assist? What can I do to offer to you? Which is a pretty interesting invitation, and we know that that's the case because he ends up doing exactly that. Well, since you asked, here's what I would ask of you. But again, he doesn't depend upon his own reasoning. It's like, God, if you open this door, I can only imagine what this must have sounded like. And it's not as though he said, can I get back to you on that? I'm going to go in the other room and pray. This seems as though it's happening in real time. So it's, oh God, please give me wisdom. Please help me to know how to answer or how to ask this question. And there's got to be kind of, I guess you can think there's got to be something in the way that this whole thing goes down that he's probably wondering, where's it going to go next? So he prays. He asks God for his assistance. And this is what ends up taking place. So the king said to me, with the king sitting next to him, I'm sorry, let me read verse 5 again. So I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you would send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Now, if you're not already familiar with this, what takes place right here in this chapter, is the beginning of a prophecy that Daniel gives to us. And we're going to go there in just a moment. And we're going to see that this singular event on this singular day set in motion a prophecy that culminated with the day that Jesus came into Jerusalem on the colt, the foal of a donkey. And so when he comes into Jerusalem at the Passover for that last time, that day that he rode into Jerusalem, what we would call Palm Sunday, or it's the triumphal entry is also another thing that we call it. That day was prophesied beginning on this day when this proclamation went out, when it was that it was handed down by Artaxerxes. So he asks, can you send me to Judah, the city of my father's tombs, verse 5, that I may rebuild it? So the fortifications, the walls, make it a defendable city. So then verse 6, then the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, which is a little unusual, and scholars love to debate about this that she would have that close of proximity. It was a little unusual, unless it's just kind of like the family, or it's a small group of people that are there. So anyway, we're not told, so there's no real reason to look into it. We can't know. How long will your journey be is his question, and when will you return? And so it pleased the king to send me, and I set for him a time. And this is, you're going to find out that he makes good on this. So he wants to be a man of integrity. So again, I don't believe for a moment he knew that this was all going to be happening this way. So they ask him, how long are you going to be gone? So again, it's not like, well, it's not an open-ended thing. If I even concede to this, you're going to have to return. So how long will you need? And so he says, I gave him a time, so of when he would be back. So I set for him a time. Now, in verse 7, furthermore, I said to the king, if it pleases the king, if you would allow this, since you've asked, I would love to answer. I'm not looking for anything, but this is the only thing that he mentions. So I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through until I come to Judah. So he realizes that there will be problems along the way. This is not a material thing. It's just, I need some kind of authorization from you where I can travel through those lands without anybody impeding my progress. So I need to have proof that I'm there and that I'm pretty much untouchable. That's what's basically being said here. Now it says in verse 8, and then also, there's another thing. This would be the only material thing that you see in this whole request. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest. Interestingly enough, how does he know that there's a guy named Asaph, and how does he know that there's a king's forest? We already know that there's much that has been said to him. he would know that this would be needed for that, but how does he know about all of this stuff? Again, we don't know. It just, there's knowledge that he has, and again, I believe that he's been thinking about this day and what it would end up needing and all the rest of it, but he waits on the Lord for the opportunity. He doesn't force the issue. And so anyhow, his prayer, his fasting has really kind of come to a place where God has not only honored it, but now God wants him to begin this work. So it says that he must give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, which pertains to the temple. So it's not just the rebuilding of the gates, but also there is another part that is to help to oversee the protection of the temple. Now, there are many who believe that this is really kind of the first time that there was something built close to the temple, what we call the Antonia Fortress, that Herod had rebuilt. And that there are people who believe that that citadel that was there during Herod's time, just because of its proximity to the temple, would have been something that had already been there and just been rebuilt and modified in Herod's time. Again, it's speculation, but there is something of a fortification, and it has a direct proximity to the temple. But then there are also other things. There's gates and those things that need to be done, but he realizes, I'm going to need timbers for this. And so when I get there, I need something. Asaph is would show that's a Jewish name. So whoever it is that's overseeing it, interesting guy, not the Asaph of David. Clearly, that's hundreds and hundreds of years in their history when David was alive. So another person with the same name, Asaph. But he's the keeper of the king's forest. That he must give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, which pertains to the temple, for the city wall, for the house that I will occupy. And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. And so retrospectively, this is his commentary of what he said he asked for, but then he throws in this extra part where God finally brought this to a place of resolution, and he wants to be making sure that we understand that. So, as he had asked for letters to get him through, there's no question to me that if it wasn't for the fact that he had this sanction from the king, what we're about to read probably would have gone a bit differently. Verse 9. So then I went to the governors in the region beyond the river, and I gave to them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. Nothing tells us that he had asked for such a thing. This seems to be a much smaller group of people that went with him than what went with Ezra. Interesting, with Ezra, he didn't want to have any kind of an escort because he didn't want to make it seem as though it was something that he wasn't trusting God and he was going to trust in man. There seems to be just a different dynamic with Nehemiah. Clearly, he trusted the Lord, but in this case, didn't see the problem with having some accompaniment. And so there's not just the letter that's given, but also there are some people that are related to the guard of Persia that accompany him as well. So, of course, that's why there's not more of an incident than there is. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being, the security, the shalom of the children of Israel. So this already tells you, and we're going to hear these guys mentioned a number of times throughout the rest of this book, the people that live there, they themselves are not people who lived in Israel, but they're on the way to that. These are people who lived in what would be where the Ammonites would be, the Moabites, that all that stuff that's on the eastern part. It's what is modern day Jordan, portions of modern day Jordan. So that's the people that have been antagonistic towards the Jews since the days of Moses and since the Exodus. There were problems with these groups of people all the way back to then. So we're talking about a really, really long time. So these were guys that wanted to do something. They were really troubled that there was somebody who wanted to see to the well-being and the security of the people there in Jerusalem. So I came to Jerusalem and was there for 3 days. So he makes his way there. He's kind of, getting a chance to relax from being done with the journey, it would appear, before he even starts to do anything. Now, what we have in verses 12 to 16 is, I'm going to put up a graphic here in a moment, but we're going to kind of look at where the gates would have been, best we can tell. And there's some of these are in question, so we'll need to kind of, well, you'll see. I'll put up the graphic in just a moment. Let me read a little bit about this. So he says in verse 12, "Then I rose up in the night, and I and a few men with me, I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, nor was there any animal with me except the one on which I had rode." So I didn't have anything with me, as his point. I didn't tell anybody what my plans to be there were, so it was very much between he and the king and whoever would have been there. But even when he gets back and he meets with the people there in Israel in those days, he didn't say what he was there to do, didn't mention anything about it. What he's going to do when everybody's doing something else, he's not going to, they're actually, this is at night, so they've already, kind of turned in, if you will, or they're not doing anything in the evening. He finds this as an ability for him to go out and kind of do reconnaissance, to go take a look around and see what they're up against. So it tells us in verse 13, I'm going to put up that graphic right now. "And I went out by night through the valley gate to the serpent well and the refuse gate, and I viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates, which were burned with fire." So from kind of what we see, when you look at this map, you'll see down in the bottom corner in the city of David, there's the Dung Gate. That would be the refuse gate. So what he's surveying is this part that is towards the south. And if you've ever been there, this is, it's not an easy way into the city, but it is a way in and out nonetheless. And it is right there where the two valleys come together, the Hinnom, or what's known as the Valley of Gehenna, and the Kidron Valley, which is what runs between the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives. And so then in verse 14, "And then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal under me to pass. And so I went up in the night by the valley, and I viewed the wall, and then I turned back and I entered the valley gate, and so I returned." So basically everything that we can gather from what he saw here wasn't really dealing with the north, but more dealing with the southern portion of the city and along the valley, the Kidron Valley that's there. That's kind of what it appears as though we're looking at. So if you have a question about that particular map and you'd like to get a copy, if you can't screenshot that, then let me know and I can send it to you. So then in verse 16, "Now the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done. I had not yet told the Jews, I had not told the priests or the nobles, the officials or the others who did the work." So everybody's kind of in the dark on this. Now, again, the next chapters that we'll be reading about this, you'll start to see it's filling in the blanks. So there's a lot of speculation as to why didn't he announce this when he first got there. There's a lot of speculation. He didn't want to have anybody give an opportunity to start either trying to work around him, change his mind on things, start to gum up the works, or he hadn't had a chance to really assess what's going to need to be done, didn't have time to consult the Lord if they got involved in the whole thing. There's a lot of speculation as to why this is. But however it is, he kind of kept it all to himself. He didn't say anything to the other people who would have some kind of input potentially. It seems as though what we get from this is that this was something that the Lord had put on his heart. It was going to be something that he was going to do, and it wasn't that he was there to consult with them. He's there to do what God has put before him. And again, we'll kind of get that added in quite a bit more once we start to read through this a little bit further. This is a man who is very much set in doing what he knows that God has sent him there to do. This is not a man who's going to be very easily persuaded to do something different. Now, as we kind of close out the chapter, the last few verses tell us this. "So then I said to them, you see the distress that we are in and how Jerusalem lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire. So come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach." Boy, what a mouthful that is. Now, in a backhanded way, it's basically, I view it this way, whether it was intended this way or not. I'm sure that these guys could have very easily taken it that as an offense, that, well, here's this guy just comes to town and he says that we're a reproach because the walls haven't been rebuilt. Well, once again, remember, He's the first person that has even brought it before the king that we have knowledge of. We have nothing that tells us that Ezra was involved in wanting to do anything like this. The scope of his job here, it seems as though, I said it last week, I believe that God would have wanted really all of this to begin immediately with Zerubbabel, to put everything back the way that it was supposed to be, and yet it took decades. It took a couple of generations, actually, when you stop to think about it. But the idea that God would return them, I believe that God would have blessed had there been a number of people who were as motivated in the ways that Ezra and Nehemiah were. If all of the people were that way and they made that their focus and weren't concerned about anything of a personal nature, they could have done this in short order, and I'm sure God would have blessed it. But that is not what has taken place up to this point. What has happened is that it is a reproach. The people surrounding them are probably pretty able to kind of mock the whole thing. I thought you guys had some grand plans. You were going to start everything up again. You can't even get your gates fixed, and here you are, 80 plus years in, 90 years in. So it's one of those things. Actually, it's even more than that. It's a thing that could easily mock them over. And so he says it's time for us not to be a reproach. It's a good thing that the temple things are taking place as they should be, but the fortifications and the rebuilding of the city and the reason for it, I mean, this should be a no-brainer. So he said, let's do this so that it's no longer a reproach. And again, I want to make sure that we understand this. A man like Nehemiah, knowing why they were displaced in the first place, which of course he would, so did Ezra, he knows why they were removed from the country. Now he gets report that the place is still a mess and there's not even fortifications. This to him is like, how can this be? Why do we allow this to be the case? We have to make this right because it doesn't honor God for his people to be in this kind of a situation. It is a reproach. So as he has prayed, God has obviously given him favor to do this. What has been something as he has put that was on his heart to do, now he's not going to let anything slow him down. And there's going to be a lot of reason for him to, fear what could be happening around him, but he's not a fearful man. He's a man who does prepare, though. It's a very, very interesting man, or he is a very interesting man. So he challenges them. Come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer be a reproach. So the wall and the gates are the first of the things to take place. Let's secure this. So I told them of the hand of my God which had been good upon me, and also the king's word that he had spoken to me. So that whole thing of the ability for him to go and do everything that he wanted to do, he shares that with the rest of them. I didn't just get myself excited about this. No. I brought this before the king, but the king had noticed something. God, if you're telling the story from what you would see, he could very easily say, God may have tipped him off. He noticed that there was something going on with me, and so I told him the whole of the matter. And then he asked if there was something that I could do, and so I asked for what I asked for, and he was gracious to give this all to me. Imagine being those guys in Jerusalem hearing this. So they hear it all. I told them of the hand of my God, and that he had been upon me, and also the king's word, that he had spoken to me. And so they said, let us rise and build. And then they set their hands to this good work. I just love that. That was like they became as motivated then as Nehemiah had become motivated. So again, it's kind of an infectious thing. And this is such an important thing for us. It's a great application to take away from this. There is something that should be in the heart of every believer when God is doing something in our lives and has given us a task. The task should be not only embraced, but there should be an excitement when God does something. And especially when he's doing something in our lives personally that may involve other people, share that. Let them know what God is doing, and that even with whatever it is that you want to do, if it's going to involve other people, have them get on board with it, because they'll see the excitement in you and know what it is that God is actually doing. And it's not just you. He wants to do this in a broader scale. On this one, it's clear he couldn't do this by himself. But he could have basically said, I need to rebuild the wall, but he wants them to have a part of it as well. He lays it out for them and says, God is in this. Look at what he's done to get it to this point, and they're on board. So they want to in on this whole thing. So, verse 19, but, once again, Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, the official, and Geshem the Arab heard of it. They laughed at us, despised us, and they said, 'What is this thing that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king?'" This sounds so familiar. So again, they don't care about what the king has to say. They don't care about the letter, because the letter would have spelled out about all of this, and there's no desire for rebellion. And if there was something that was kind of hidden from the king, his letter would have kind of already addressed all of that stuff. So rather, it would be a very easy thing for them to try, as had been done with Ezra. Let's try to stop the whole thing by making the king be concerned that the people that are going back to do the rebuilding are really trying to fortify the place, and then they're going to become, antagonistic towards Persia. That would be, again, the easiest way to stir up a whole bunch of people and get a report to be brought back to Artaxerxes. So you can already see the undercurrent of this whole thing. It just is such a repeating kind of a thing. Once again, here's a great application of this. Whenever God is doing something in any of our lives, we've got to understand that there will be opposition. So the opposition is to try to get us to not embrace and to do what God has put before us. So discouragement, difficulty, something not working out quite like we would want it to, or there's not the real ease with which it should be going, whatever the case may be, the idea that something would prevent us or slow us from the work that God wants to do, we have to expect that. But if we're convinced rather that the Lord is actually doing something, it doesn't matter what opposition is there. Embrace it and bring it to a completion. This is what God asks us to do. So he seems very, very intent on doing precisely that. So they wanted to rebel. So then I answered to them. I love his answer. His answer is really, really cool. His answer is this: "So I answered them, and I said to them, 'The God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and we will build. But you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem.'" Now, this is an interesting thing, because it is, boy, this really works even into our day. It's an important thing for them to Nehemiah and the people who are with him, they need to understand something, and the opponents also need to understand something. It is important for Nehemiah and his people to be reminded, this is the land that God has given to us. Not only is it the nation that God has given to us, the boundaries of it, which they never really fully took in all of the boundaries. You find those in Genesis 15:18, I believe. He basically lays out where the whole thing is. And what should have been their territory is so far beyond what they had ever grabbed onto. And yet, nonetheless, what they did end up occupying as far as the land had been something that God had promised to them hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before. And the fact that he had led them to the place, David in particular, of where the temple would be and where David's city would be, Jerusalem. God was the one who selected that, not David, not anyone else. God said, "This is where I want you to be." So it is a place on the map. It is a country, but in particular on a mountain. Among, I call them mountains. It's a series of hills. Now it's a couple thousand feet above sea level. By the time you get to Jerusalem, it's around 22 to 2,300 feet above sea level. But it's just a number of different hills and valleys, and all that stuff is in that whole area. But they're not big, huge, rolling hills and big, large valleys. I mean, it's just like this, if you've never been there. But the plot of land where the city of David was, and then where the Temple Mount is, it's something that you could easily walk all around it and all throughout it easily in a day. The map that I had up earlier, that part there, you could be walking around and see every square inch of it if you needed to, or at least walk through all the four corners and all the parts in between. You could do it very easily all throughout a day. So it's a very small place, but it was what God had given them. Important in that is that the people who were there, who were the adversaries, had no part in this. God did not give them the land. They are not his people. They are part of his creation, yet the covenant that God made with Abraham was to this specific group of people in that particular part of the world, and in that particular city. God had made that the place through David where his name would be known. That's where the temple was. So even to this day, it's very, very important. There's all kinds of intrigue as far as the world is concerned, and nations have all kinds of problems about it. It doesn't change the fact that God gave the land to whom he gave it to. And for those in the church that say, well, they abandoned that because they didn't accept Jesus as Messiah, that's not what the Scripture says. That's what people have read into it. That promise that God gave to them, that He gave them a land, that it would be a forever promise, He didn't change His mind on that. Go read Genesis 12 and try to tell me that somehow the church replaces Israel. It's just absurd. So important for us to recognize that these people here are told, you have no past, you have no present, you have no future in this place. We, on the other hand, do. So they have that past, and this is why when we go to Israel, I love to be able to point out just how ancient the Jewish sites are. They've been in that land for thousands of years because God gave it to them. Clearly, you cannot separate them from the land. They can be removed out of it for a time, but God's promise to give it to them for it to be a forever established place, that it belongs to them, that has been in place. That promise has been there for thousands of years. It just doesn't change. So with all of that said, he concludes that part by saying, let us arise and build. But you, as far as you're concerned, you guys can go ahead and mock, you can ridicule, you can say all the things that you want to. Here's what we know. We have a history here. It's a history that has been, that is, and will be. It isn't your history, it's ours. You have no part in this. It's just basically mind your own business. This has nothing to do with you. So before we conclude here, I want to get back to the letter that was spoken of, and the rebuilding, which is found in verse 8. A letter he asked for the person of the kings, the keeper of the king's forest, that he would give us timber to make the beams for the gates of the citadel and the temple. And then look at the last sentence. And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. This is the decree. This is where the letter is. It kind of starts that whole ball rolling. I had mentioned Daniel 9 before. Let's go there because, again, this is a hugely, hugely important event in history, and God uses it as a marker for starting a timetable and for a sequence of events. So the whole, what we call the 70 weeks prophecy, it begins at verse 24 of chapter 9. And it's where we get this 70 weeks. And when we hear week, we think 7 days. But there are times when these weeks can be not just 24-hour days, but 1 year. And a week of years is 7 years. Times 70, 490 years. That's the prophecy that's being made here. It's for your people and for your holy city, to finish transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up vision and prophecy. The only thing that fits that prophecy and the way that sin could be dealt with had to be something that God provided a provision for the matter of sin. It's putting away iniquity and sin. You can't look at anything from the time that Daniel gave this prophecy that anything historical ever happened aside from Messiah. But look at what else is there. And at the very last verse, in the very last part of verse 24, and to anoint the most holy. Know and understand, therefore, that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, just a poetic way of saying, and there are people who believe that there's a much different significance to the fact that he didn't just straight out say that there are 69 weeks, but it says from the going forth of the command. That's the important part. When was it first decreed to rebuild that temple? And we get that from Nehemiah chapter 2. So we're told the days that those things are given, tells us when that whole thing began, the process. But we know that setting that in motion, it was 483 years from the time of that prophecy until we get to the time that Jesus comes into Jerusalem on that day. Now, what's the other part of that? Let's take a look in Luke. Let me get to the actual verse because I didn't write it down. Luke. Chapter 19. chapter 19 at verse 41. It's a good thing. Good thing that I always have the Bible that I know, because I can tell you where it is on the page. I've had this Bible for like 35 years. And so I know where everything is. That's why I can't get another Bible, because everything's in the wrong place. So I have to keep getting this one rebound. Everything is right where it's supposed to be. Chapter 19, verse 41. Now as Jesus drew near, he saw the city and he wept over it. This is triumphal entry. This is a week before his resurrection. It is just days before his arrest and his crucifixion, and then his being put into the tomb. Now as he drew near, he saw the city, wept over it, saying, if you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. I believe that in verse 42, he is holding them accountable. This is a day that you should have known. And so it is prophesied also in the Psalms about, this is the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. That's sung pretty much in a lot of churches, and on triumphal entries, really the only, if it's a commemoration, that would have been the day. So this is that particular day prophesied through Daniel, through the Psalms, and here now he is coming in. This is also the Hosanna that we hear about, him coming in, save now, send prosperity, all of that. That has all taken place, but the whole sequence of events that they should have known was given through Daniel based upon what was done in Nehemiah. So some people could look at that and say, well, that's an awful lot of stuff for people to know. They should be, that's a lot to ask of them to be aware of those things. And I would just have to say, is it? If he's sending a Jewish Messiah to the nation of Israel, to Jewish people, they shouldn't know that, or it's too much for them to know. I think we underestimate if there is that kind of a mentality. We don't understand what God really does want us to know. And the fact that if he's going to take the time to have it written out and be that precise and that particular, he's not doing it for himself. He's doing that for the people who would seek him out, and if they will seek him, he will be found. So chapter 2 of Nehemiah begins that process. Prophesied through the Psalms, prophesied through Zechariah, chapter 9. Let me get to the Psalm. I want to say it's Psalm, is it 110? Let's take a look. It is not. It is Psalm 118. Speaking of the same day of the triumphal entry, at verse 22, Psalm 118, the stone which the builders have rejected has become the chief cornerstone. It is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes, and this is the day that the Lord has made, and we will rejoice in it. This is what they were saying at the time when they were putting down their clothes and palms and all that. Save now, O Lord, I pray. Send now prosperity. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We have blessed you from the house of our God. That is what was being said. That's the Hosanna that was being said as he came in over in the Mount of Olives and down into the area of the temple. Once again, the date was prophesied to the day from the going forth of this decree that we see in chapter 2. So again, when you take all of that into account and understand the precision of it, it is intended for them to be accountable, yes, but it's also to let us know that these things don't just happen without some kind of forethought, and God is the one who has laid it out. So that once again, man is without excuse. They can't plead ignorance. God would be able to say, I had it written down for you. Ignorance is no defense, ultimately. So we'll pick up at chapter 3 next week. Once again, as we went through that, if the graphic that I put up is something that you'd like a copy of and you don't know how to get a screenshot, or your computer doesn't allow it, let me know. You can reach me through the ministry email found at the website, which is oldpaththeology.net. And I mentioned a lot about the area around Jerusalem and the place of the city of David and all that. We have trips that we take to Israel as often as we can, And I wanted to let you know we have one scheduled for the 15th through the 27th of March next year, 2023. And right now there are no restrictions through, for COVID or anything else, no testing, no restrictions of any kind that I know of. And we actually have the places that I really wanted to get to and where I wanted to be able to stay so that we were able to see things that we want to see. We're going to limit the size of the trip so that it's not so many people that it's hard to get from place to place. So if you're interested, contact me through, again, the email, and I'll be happy to send you the details on it. So with that, we'll conclude, and I'll see you next week for Chapter 3.